U.S. constitutional law focusing on the freedom of expression. Before entering academia, Greg clerked at the Supreme Court for Justice Stevens, and his first book was published in 2017 called Managed Speech, the Roberts Court's First Amendment. We're very lucky to have him here today. Let's welcome him.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thanks to the Ethical Society for inviting me here today. I wish that there was a mindful breathing pause before every time I spoke in public. That would be, I like that. That's a good thing. And thank you all for being here. My wife was just reminding me before we started of one of our favorite family inside jokes. We were taking my daughter and a friend of hers to Cahokia Mounds. This was, my daughter was in about 5th grade, and this friend, lovely kid, and she said as politely and as chipper as can be, "I hate learning on weekends." So I will try not to make learning on the weekend too painful. I should also say that my daughter, who is now 15, is this afternoon giving a cabaret performance. So in the context of our family, I'm the opening act today. And as befits a good opening act, I will try to be relatively brief. I actually want to get my timer out here to kind of keep tabs. I was told to talk for about a half hour. Now I've been invited here today to talk about free speech issues, and I could blather on about that topic all day, so I'm not going to do that because partially I want to save some energy for the Q&A. I will mention, as to the Q&A, I always like to sort of toss a little bit of red meat out to get people thinking. So while I'm going to talk to you about free speech issues, I am a constitutional law professor. As Rachel mentioned, I clerked on the Supreme Court, so I have some insights about the Supreme Court, about other constitutional issues that might be in prominent public discussion. I'm just saying, if you want to ask me about any of that stuff later, I will be happy. Actually, ask me about anything at all, I'll give it my best shot, but certainly beyond the scope of what I'm particularly going to talk about. So when I got this invitation, I was asked for a title, and I'll admit I was having kind of a dark day. So I went with Free Speech 2022, It's Worse Than You Think. I'm not going to say that if I was having a good day, it would have been Free Speech 2022, Sunshine and Bunnies, but I was feeling a little pessimistic. Unfortunately, I have to say, although I'm in a much better place today, that pessimism is a pretty strong conviction. I think that the climate of free speech in our society today really is troubled and problematic, and I want to talk to you about why I think that. And I'm going to break this down essentially into two parts, what I discussed today. First, I want to talk about what I think are the most important free speech problems that our society is actually dealing with. And then I want to talk about First Amendment law and how First Amendment law, particularly but not exclusively the Supreme Court, is failing to address those serious problems. And in what I do in studying constitutional law and studying constitutional free speech issues, that disconnect is to me one of the most important things that is afflicting us and that I think is well worth talking about. All right, so first, what I see as our most important free speech problems. I want to talk about three things: speech inequality, ineffective public discourse, and crackdowns on political dissent. So first, speech inequality. What does this mean? It's a simple enough phrase, but when we talk about the First Amendment and free speech, we're typically talking about, canonically anyway, a liberty issue. Free speech means the freedom to speak, the liberty to speak. And when we talk about liberty, we don't always think at the same time about equality. But I think when it comes to free speech, when it comes to public discourse, equality is tremendously important, essential. The ability, the capacity of all kinds of people in society to participate in public discussion, to hear and to be heard. And for various reasons, I think that equality is under great stress and strain in our current situation. I'll talk about a few aspects of this. The first couple of aspects deal with the internet, deal with contemporary mass communication in its most familiar form. So one manifestation of speech inequality is the continued domination of powerful, wealthy speech intermediaries. I'm old enough that when I went to law school, it was still pre-internet. I was in law school from '89 to '93, so just at the cusp of the communications revolution that we are now very much in the thick of. And so I came of age in the era, as many of you I think did, of the big three broadcast networks. That was our sort of model of how mass communication worked. You had these giant intermediaries, the cost of entry into mass public discourse, into the possibility of reaching a mass audience was extremely high. Ordinary people really couldn't do it. And so we had these enormous speech mediators that really dominated and dictated the terms of public discussion. It wasn't just the big three networks. It was growing cable networks. It was major newspapers. But it was, generally speaking, large corporations. And I remember when I went to law school and started to study First Amendment law, the thing that sort of drove me and tantalized me was the idea that, okay, if we could only get out of this paradigm, if we could only get into a world where the cost of entry to reaching a mass audience was lower, where ordinary people had a way to participate in and be a part of public discourse, where there was a flattening of those barriers of entry, that would be great. So, welcome to paradise. We've got that now. And it hasn't really turned out the way we wanted it to. And one remarkable sort of factor in our contemporary communications landscape is the perpetuation of giant, wealthy, powerful speech mediators. Now it's not the big three networks anymore. Now it is social media platforms, internet service providers, and search engines predominantly, and the money behind all of those entities. So yeah, we do live in a world, and this is significant. I don't mean to trivialize the sort of positive side of this story. We do live in a world where ordinary people are able to participate in public discourse in a way that was not possible when I was in law school and in the years before that. But we have seen the old form of speech intermediation by capital replaced by a new form of speech intermediation by capital. And that new form in its way is just as powerful, just as constraining, just as controlling of public discourse as the old form was. It's just taking a very different shape. Another manifestation of speech inequality related to speech technology is the persistence of what has long been called the digital divide, disparities in people's access to the means of mass communication. Again, there's a positive side to the story. We do not live anymore in an era where the cost of entry to reaching a mass audience was the cost of a broadcast license and broadcasting infrastructure. So in that sense, we're a lot better off. And a lot more people have greater access to mass discussion. But there's still a great deal of inequality in people's access. That inequality breaks down to some extent along racial lines, to some extent along lines of gender, but especially along lines of class. There was a statistic I found in 2019, which is the most recent information on this I could find, for households with incomes of $75,000 to $99,000 a year. 79% of households in that income bracket had home internet access. For households with income under $25,000, the number was 57%. Now that's still a lot. 57% is substantially better than nothing, but that's also a really significant divide. And there are factors that pile on top of that to make it even worse. So I think I said home internet access. That statistic was actually just for internet access. Home internet access, the disparity is a little bit greater, and that's a big deal because of privacy. As you probably all know from using the internet, to do a lot of the things you want to do online, it's very important to be able to do it in sort of the comfort and privacy of your own space, whether that's participating in controversial discussions or engaging in ordinary pursuits like banking and e-commerce of various kinds. It's sort of not the same deal if you have to go to your public library in order to be able to access those things. So there's still, even as the access to the infrastructure of speech has grown a lot more equal, there's still a sort of sneaky important degree of inequality that doesn't get talked about a whole lot, but that dramatically constrains a lot of people's capacity to participate in this bounty of electronic public discourse. And then finally, there's another phenomenon that contributes to speech inequality that I call identity polarized discourse. This is actually an idea that I borrow from voting rights law. In voting rights law, a big factor in certain legal tests is the idea of polarized voting. So if you're going to make out a claim for racial discrimination in voting, one of the things that you have to show making out a certain kind of Voting Rights Act claim is that your group is subject to what's called racially polarized voting, which means what you would think it means. The idea that your group is sort of subject to, typically you're African American, you're Latino, that your group is subject to sort of adversarial voting by the majority, the white majority population. Something not exactly the same, but kind of similar happens with public discourse, and online in particular. We see it in all kinds of ways. The basic reality that drives this notion in voting rights law and in free speech is that groups are of different sizes. You know, for all of the nuances we talk about with racial justice and injustice, one of the biggest determinants is simple size. There's more still now, not for much longer, but for now, more white people around than anybody else. So if there is adversarial discourse, if people are going to gang up on people, the white people have a much better opportunity to gang up on African Americans, Latino people. Straight people have a greater capacity to gang up on LGBTQ people. Men and women, it's a little bit more complicated, but the power dynamics, even though the numbers don't shake out the same way, the power dynamics kind of work the same way. So we have phenomena of just constant online harassment of what I'm very technically now calling minority groups by majority groups, by larger groups. It's obviously not everybody, but there are enough people in the majority group that the worst edge of that majority can do a great deal of harm because it has numbers. And of course, that also feeds into what we saw with what we've seen and what we're exploring with the recent Buffalo massacre and the perpetuation of noxious ideas online among, again, the sort of worst fringe of the majority population. So all of these facets of speech inequality add up to one of what I think are the big problems of free speech today. Second big problem, one that I won't have to go too far to explain because it's something that we're all pretty familiar with, is just the ineffectiveness or what I call the noise of current public discourse. We've got this great mass speech capacity where we can all talk to each other, where we can all learn from each other, and yet for a variety of complicated reasons, too often it doesn't work out that way. Instead, what we get is noise, what we get is cacophony, what we get is just generally non-constructive discussion. And that has, again, a bunch of different facets. One is the phenomenon of information scarcity. In that pre-internet era that I was talking about of domination by the big three networks first and foremost, we talked a lot about, when we talked about free speech, we talked a lot about scarcity as a problem. And in that era, the scarcity problem was a resource problem. Again, the cost of entry to reaching a mass audience was really large. The capacity to reach a mass audience was scarce. The infrastructure, the resources were scarce. That's not so true anymore, although as I was describing a couple of minutes ago, it's still somewhat true. But the big scarcity problem of the internet era is different, but no less significant, and it's the scarcity of human attention. Now we have more information than any of us could ever possibly process in 1,000 lifetimes. And as a result of that, the difficulty of public discourse is the difficulty, or put it this way, the challenge of public discourse for moneyed interests that are trying to dominate public discourse is to capture that attention. It's the search for clickbait is the simplest form of this. But our attention is a precious, scarce resource. And different speakers are constantly trying to capture that resource, and obviously the speakers that are in the best position to capture that resource are the ones with the greatest resources. Certainly there are all kinds of heartwarming stories of online phenomena out of the blue, just ordinary people who become influencers on social media, and that's great, but in the aggregate, our public discourse is still dominated by the entities that have the resources and the wherewithal to capture that precious, scarce resource of human attention. Second aspect of our noisy public discourse, another very familiar one, is disinformation and misinformation. I don't have to talk too much about this because we encounter it every day, but we know, and we learned, I think, an especially hard lesson after the Brexit vote in the UK and the 2016 election here, that the technology of communication that we now have, while in theory just a great vehicle for the propagation of truth and useful ideas, is also, and perhaps more commonly, a vehicle for the propagation of falsity and destructive ideas. And we don't all necessarily have to agree on what is false and what is destructive, but I think most of us could fairly easily agree that we are awash in disinformation and misinformation. And because of that limited capacity of human attention, it becomes easier for the proponents of disinformation and misinformation to have their speech take hold, to dominate and capture a degree of our attention, and to very seriously sabotage a lot of social processes by doing so. And then finally, another pretty familiar phenomenon, although you may or may not have heard this lingo, is what people who study online communication call filter bubbles. Filter bubbles is basically just a way of talking about our ability to silo into our own little cocoons of information, where we only get the information that we want to get. We only get the information that we agree with. Most of us are probably prone to this to some extent or another. You know, you can be committed to accessing and considering a wide range of ideas, but sometimes it just gets exhausting. And sometimes you just want to hear the people who agree with you, the people who are comfortable to hear. And we now have the capacity to do that like we never have before. Of course, there is a significant percentage of the population that either through intent or just through habit is not prone to seek out opposing ideas, that just sits in front of particular sources of information. Okay, the heck with it, Fox News, and just takes that all in constantly and doesn't have any concept of opposing ideas. And so that siloing, that separation into filter bubbles, into little pockets of ideological space where we don't even consider or contemplate ideas contrary to ours, is another huge problem with public discourse. The third big problem with free speech, the final one that I want to emphasize, sort of takes us away from the online world and into the physical world mostly, although it has its online component too, and that's crackdowns by government on political dissent. We, again, are in this era where mass communication of a great variety of ideas is more easily possible than it has ever been before. But unfortunately, one reaction to that by government has been to work harder in some ways than it ever has before to try to suppress political dissent. This is exactly what the First Amendment is primarily designed to prevent, and as I'll explain in a couple of minutes, for a variety of reasons, the First Amendment First Amendment law isn't doing a great job of preventing it. But it's just worth emphasizing how major and multifaceted attacks on political dissent are today. Let's start here in St. Louis and start in the physical world, in the street. Let's start with the Stockley Protests and what the St. Louis police did when people came out to peacefully protest the Stockley verdict. They basically savagely attacked protesters, busted heads, with intent because these were protesters against the police and the police didn't like that. That is, if you want to start having a discussion about the First Amendment, what shouldn't happen, that's the first thing that shouldn't happen, but it does happen. And it hasn't just happened here in St. Louis, it hasn't just happened with the Stockley verdicts, with the Ferguson protests, it's happened all over the country. On top of that, we've got unprecedented legislative initiatives to suppress political dissent. There's a great resource online from the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law called the U.S. Protest Law Tracker. And if you look at that tracker, which sort of keeps updating legislative initiatives in the states to try to suppress political protest in various ways, as of now, 40 states since 2017 have enacted new anti-protest legislation of various kinds, and bills are pending in 38 states to do even more damage. Obviously, if you do the math, there's some significant overlap even between those two numbers. And then talking about suppression of political protest, there's also maybe the most recent thing we've seen, the sort of right-wing initiative to simply erase speech, particularly in educational settings, about topics that are uncomfortable to people on the right. So the Don't Say Gay bill in California, the right-wing mania for suppressing discussion of racial justice and racial injustice. This is another important, crucial, because it happens in public education in particular, crucial form of suppression of political dissent. All right, so there's a lot going wrong with free speech, a lot to worry about. And you would think, you would hope, that First Amendment law would be addressing all of those very serious free speech problems at various points in the past, particularly in the 1950s, 1960s, and to some extent into the 1970s. The Supreme Court, in formulating First Amendment law, did pay attention to the most serious free speech problems and try to tailor First Amendment law to address those problems. That's not what's happening now. Rachel mentioned I wrote a book a few years ago about the current Supreme Court's, or I guess the recent current Supreme Court's free speech First Amendment jurisprudence, and the disconnect between that jurisprudence and the problems I've just been discussing could hardly be more dramatic. What has the Supreme Court been doing while all of this bad stuff has been going on? One thing that the Supreme Court has been doing is obsessively increasing free speech protections for wealthy and powerful speakers, putting most of its First Amendment energy into protecting the interests of wealthy and powerful speakers. And this has taken a variety of forms. One that you're probably familiar with, although we haven't heard much about it for a few years now because there's not much more for the Supreme Court to do, is the protection of wealthy people's use of money in political campaigns. So you all probably know about the Citizens United case. And actually, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The Roberts Court, in its First Amendment jurisprudence, has decided more campaign finance cases than any other kind of case. And virtually all of those cases have significantly expanded the capacity of wealthy, powerful speakers and institutions to influence elections through money. From the standpoint of the current Supreme Court, that is literally the most important First Amendment problem in our society. Not speech inequality, not crackdowns on dissent, not toxic, noisy public discourse, but the insufficient ability of wealthy people to get their way in elections. So that's what the Supreme Court has been up to. Another thing that the current Supreme Court has been obsessed with is, to put it very bluntly, protecting the capacity of conservative Christian speakers to influence public affairs. And in particular, and in a focus that's become even more salient over the past few weeks as we've learned what we have learned. In particular, the Roberts Court has been very assiduous about making sure that anti-abortion speakers can influence public discourse. The court has made it harder for cities and states to restrict activity, sort of aggressive speech around abortion clinics and other facilities that provide abortion and family planning counseling. And on the flip side, the Roberts Court has made it harder for states and cities to inform people when they are being sort of misguided and hoodwinked by anti-abortion institutions. So these so-called crisis pregnancy centers that kind of conceal their attempts to steer people away from abortions. California adopted some regulations a few years ago just trying to make these crisis pregnancy centers admit what they were and sort of say, hey, you know, some of us were not a licensed clinic, we're giving you a certain kind of advice, but there are other kinds of advice available. The Supreme Court said that those California regulations violated the First Amendment because they impinged on the ability of the crisis pregnancy centers to speak as they wished to speak and to influence as they wished to influence. And if all of that isn't bad enough, we've got something on the horizon that may be even more significant in the aggregate. And it's what I call a change to the structural First Amendment. Back in the, again, let's talk for a minute about the pre-internet era, One thing that was an unquestioned power of government to kind of influence the media landscape was regulations, restrictions of media ownership. So some of these laws are still in effect, not really at the national level, but there were limitations on the ability of a single company to own, for example, a newspaper and a broadcast outlet in the same market. There were limitations on how many radio stations any given company could own. Those regulations were, just as a policy matter, eventually eviscerated at the federal level, and most of them at the state levels as well. And now the pendulum is swinging so far in the other direction that the Supreme Court seems poised to make those kinds of structural regulations into First Amendment violations. That's a big deal. Normally, the old school divide was kind of the government can't regulate the content of speech, but it may, notwithstanding the First Amendment, regulate the sort of structures of the media industry. So one example, a sort of contemporary iteration of that, is the net neutrality idea. Regulations that have kind of been kicked back and forth between administrations of different parties, advocated by Democrats, where internet service providers can't discriminate in how they provide access to information. That's been a big, again, sort of initiative on the left and center left, and until recently, no one even gave an inkling of a thought to the idea that that kind of regulation might violate the First Amendment. But Brett Kavanaugh, when he was on the DC Circuit before he ascended to the Supreme Court, wrote an opinion saying exactly that net neutrality violates the First Amendment because internet service providers are speakers and they should get to discriminate in the provision of speech as they wish to. And given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, which is as ideologically solid as any Supreme Court has been maybe since the 1930s, and as right-wing as any Supreme Court has been since the 1930s, it would not surprise me at all for the court to sort of embrace that Kavanaugh idea and to restrict even structural regulation of media. And that's a huge deal in an era, as I was describing before, of these new speech intermediaries. If the government can't regulate even the ownership structures of social media, search engines, et cetera, then those entities will be even more unfettered in their ability to control public discourse in the service of profit. So, okay, the Supreme Court's obsessed with expanding the speech of wealthy and powerful speakers. What else is the Supreme Court doing? Well, there's a category of free speech problems that I refer to as speech and government preserves. Public property, common property, government institutions like schools, prisons, military bases. These are the sites of kind of really interesting First Amendment problems over time because everybody sort of agrees, all right, the government has more latitude, should have more latitude to restrict speech in some ways in spaces that the government itself is trying to control for particular purposes than it does when it's just trying to regulate our private speech. The reason this is especially important is that if you don't have money, if you don't have resources, those public fora, as we call them, are really, really important for your ability to engage in effective free speech. The law on this stuff has never been great, but in the past, it's at least been pretty good. The Supreme Court in the 1970s sort of developed this thing called the Public Forum Doctrine that acknowledged the importance of allowing a largely unfettered free speech in, for example, public streets and sidewalks, areas where people without resources can go to reach audiences that congregate in those places. That whole phenomenon has been diminished somewhat just by changes in social life and technology, but the Supreme Court in recent years has done what it can to make matters worse. So the Supreme Court has decided some cases about free speech by public employees, free speech by public school students, prisoners, and most of those cases have gone badly for the speakers. The court has decided cases about public forums. There was an interesting case several years back in a little town in Utah where a sort of small religious group called Summum wanted to donate a monument to place in a public park with Summum's aphorisms, sort of main religious tenets. And Summum was fairly confident that it could do this and that the law would protect it in doing this because in this little town in Utah, there was a Ten Commandments monument in the park. So someone comes in and says, hey, we want our 8 aphorisms there in the park alongside the 10 Commandments, and surely you can't discriminate against our speech. Supreme Court said, yeah, they can discriminate against your speech, except, here's the twist, it's not really even discrimination, because when the government accepts a monument, a donation to place in a public park, that's no longer the speech of the speaker who donated the thing. That becomes government speech. And so the government itself can make whatever choices it wants about what monuments it places in parks, what speech it allows in that respect in public settings. And so in those ways, the court has diminished the ability of people to use, in various ways, the court's diminished the ability of people to use these public forums, these government preserves as vehicles of inexpensive and ready expression. And then finally, the last thing I'll sort of note is the court's just blatant disregard for a lot of serious First Amendment concerns related to the problems I was discussing before. I'll cast this kind of in terms of First Amendment doctrine now. At certain times in the past, not consistently, not enough, but to some extent, the Supreme Court, in formulating First Amendment law, has treated distributive justice, equality, as an important First Amendment principle. Public forum doctrine is one example of that. Other examples would include special protection for other kinds of inexpensive media, like signs and handbills, and particular attention to the free speech First Amendment interests of minority speakers, not just in the demographic sense, but in the political sense, like minor political parties. Now, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roberts has done nothing about any of those things, has completely ignored them. The press, remember the press? We used to have kind of a thing in the First Amendment, we still do in the text of the First Amendment, called the Press Clause, which suggests that the press is supposed to get special First Amendment solicitude to do the important job of informing the public about matters of public concern. The Roberts Court has literally not decided a single case under the First Amendment Press Clause. We're going back, it's coming on 20 years now, and the Press Clause has just completely been ignored and fallen into disuse. And finally, again, tying back to something I was discussing as a big First Amendment problem, the Roberts Court has done nothing about suppression of political dissent, except in a few cases when it comes to political activity by right-wing speakers. In the Warren Court era of the 1960s, the great liberal era of rights expansion, Warren Court decided a case that made clear that the government can't punish or suppress speech even when that speech is advocating violent overthrow of the government. Of course, the government can punish actual attempts to violently overthrow the government, but if somebody says, I think it would be good to violently overthrow the government, the Warren Court decides this case that says the government can't suppress that. That's free speech. The speaker in that case was a Ku Klux Klan leader. So the left-wing Warren Court, or the liberal Warren Court, made this important free speech advance in the name of or in the context of speech by an extreme right-wing speaker. You will see no analog to that in the jurisprudence of the Roberts Court. Left-wing liberal speakers who have free speech grievances basically need not apply. So the gist of all of this is we live in this tantalizing era of great possibilities for free expression, of an unprecedented opportunity for people to speak across boundaries of geography and identity and ideology, and to speak to each other and to learn from each other. And for a lot of sociological, technological, and political reasons, we have fallen drastically short of that promise. And to the extent we might expect legal structures, First Amendment law in particular to help us, rather than making matters better, the Supreme Court is making matters worse. And I suggest that if we believe that free speech is important, we're not getting the free speech we deserve, and we need to fight and press our institutions to do a lot better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you for making yourself available afterward for questions. I'm sure there will be many.